In the unforgiving desert of New Mexico Territory, 1893, a pregnant widow and her 2 sons make a discovery that will change their lives forever. Lydia Weatherall, carrying a child conceived in grief and traveling with 17-year-old Caleb and 14-year-old Ezra, finds an unconscious stranger collapsed beside his horse under the merciless sun. The man is Elias Truett, the territory's wealthiest cattle baron, struck down by heatstroke and a failing heart. What begins as a simple act of mercy, nursing him back to health beneath a makeshift shelter, becomes something far more complicated when they learn this bitter, lonely man has no family and countless enemies circling his vast fortune. As they escort him home to his sprawling ranch, whispers follow them, painting Lydia as a gold digger and her family as opportunists. But when rival claimants arrive with guns and forged documents, demanding their share of Truett's empire, the real question emerges. What happens when a dying man's greatest treasure isn't his land or cattle, but the family he never had? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a canvas of bleached earth and scattered sage that seemed to mock human ambition. Lydia Weatherall pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the child within her shift restlessly as their wagon creaked over another rut in what barely passed for a road. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had buried one husband and now carried the child of another, a brief, desperate union born of loneliness rather than love. "Ma, you sure about this land Pa Murphy told us about?" Caleb's voice carried the uncertainty of 17 years, trying to sound like 30. He held the reins with capable hands, his father's hands, though his eyes held questions that Benjamin Weatherall had never lived to answer. Lydia studied her eldest son's profile, the strong jaw already shadowed with whiskers, the way he squinted against the sun like his father had done during those long campaigns against the Apache. "Patrick Murphy never lied to us before, son. Said it was good grazing land, just needed someone willing to work it." 14-year-old Ezra shifted on the wagon bench beside his brother, his slight frame dwarfed by Caleb's broader shoulders. Where Caleb had inherited his father's build, Ezra possessed his mother's quick mind and careful observations. "Seems mighty empty out here for good grazing land," he said, then immediately looked apologetic for questioning their plan. The truth was, Lydia had her own doubts. Patrick Murphy's description of prime cattle country just waiting for the right family hadn't mentioned the bone-dry creek beds or the way the horizon shimmered with heat mirages that promised water where none existed. But the alternative, staying in Roswell with her late husband's debts mounting and her condition becoming more obvious by the day, had driven them to this desperate gamble. The child she carried wasn't Benjamin's. Her husband had been dead 8 months when grief and loneliness had led her to Thomas Brennan's arms during one terrible winter night. Thomas had been kind enough, a drifter passing through who'd helped repair their roof, but he'd disappeared before dawn without even knowing what their brief encounter had created. Now she carried this secret shame alongside the growing life within her, hoping that distance and a fresh start might grant them all redemption. "Water up ahead," Caleb announced, pointing toward a cluster of mesquite trees that promised shade and relief. As they approached, Lydia noticed something odd about the scene. A horse stood riderless near the trees, its reins trailing, ears pinned back in distress. The animal was magnificent bay gelding with expensive tack that spoke of wealth and careful breeding. "Hold up," she said softly, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle beside her on the bench. That's when they saw him. An older man lay crumpled in the sparse shade of the largest mesquite, his face flushed red beneath silver hair, his breathing shallow and labored. His clothes marked him as someone of mean shan-tooled boots, silver conchos on his hatband, and a vest cut from fine wool despite the desert heat. Ezra was off the wagon before it fully stopped, his natural compassion overriding caution. "Ma, he's burning up." Lydia moved more carefully, her pregnancy making quick movements awkward, but her nursing instincts kicked in immediately. She'd tended enough soldiers during the border conflicts to recognize heat exhaustion when she saw it. The man's pulse was rapid and thready, his skin hot and dry, dangerous signs in this climate. "Caleb, get our water. Ezra, help me get his vest off. We need to cool him down before his body gives out entirely." They worked with practiced efficiency, the boys following their mother's calm directions. Lydia had learned during the war that panic killed more people than bullets or fever. She poured precious water onto her spare petticoat and began cooling the stranger's face and neck, while Caleb rigged a better shelter, using their canvas and wagon tongue. "Think he'll make it?" Caleb asked, his voice betraying the boy beneath the man's responsibilities. "He's strong," Lydia replied, noting the stranger's broad shoulders and calloused hands. "Built for this country, just pushed too hard, too fast." She studied his face, weathered but distinguished, with the kind of deep lines that came from years of squinting into sun and wind. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. The man's eyes fluttered open pale blue, like winter skyand, fixed on her face with surprising intensity. "Angel," he whispered, his voice cracked and rough. "No, sir, just a neighbor," Lydia replied gently. "You're suffering from the heat. We're going to take care of you." He tried to sit up, but she pressed him back down with a firm hand. "Easy now. You're safe." "My horse?" "Right here and fine. Better than you are at the moment." She tilted his head and helped him sip small amounts of water. "What's your name?" The stranger's eyes seemed to focus with effort. "Elias. Elias Truett." He said it as if the name should mean something to her. Caleb's sharp intake of breath told her it did. Everyone in the territory had heard of Elias Truett, the cattle baron, who owned more land than some eastern states, whose herds numbered in the thousands. They said he was ruthless in business, that he'd driven smaller ranchers off their land and crushed anyone who stood in his way. They also said he was richer than Croesus and twice as hard. "Well, Mr. Truett," Lydia said, keeping her voice steady despite her racing heart, "you picked a poor day for traveling alone." A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. Seemed important at the time. His eyes moved to the boys, both watching him with curious intensity. "Your sons?" "Caleb and Ezra," she confirmed. "I'm Lydia Weatherall." Weatherall. He seemed to consider the name. "You're not from around here." Roswell originally, heading west to claim some land. Something shifted in Truett's expressions, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. But before he could respond, his eyes rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness again. They spent the rest of the afternoon tending him, moving him periodically to follow the shade, forcing water between his lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. As evening approached and his condition stabilized, Lydia found herself studying this man, whose reputation had reached even their small corner of the territory. Up close, Elias Truett looked older than she'd expected, perhaps 65 or more. But there was still strength in the set of his shoulders and the way his hands, even in sleep, seemed ready to grasp reins or rope. His silver hair was thick and well-groomed, his mustache carefully trimmed. Even in his current state, he carried himself like a man accustomed to command. "Ma," Ezra said quietly, settling beside her as she kept watch, "why do you suppose he was out here alone? Man like that must have plenty of hands to do his traveling for him." It was a good question. Men of Truett's stature didn't typically ride the desert trails without an escort, especially not at his age. "Maybe he had his reasons," she replied. "Sometimes a man needs to be alone with his thoughts." "Or his regrets," Caleb added, surprising her with his insight. As the desert began to cool with approaching dusk, Truett's breathing grew stronger and more regular. When he opened his eyes again, they were clearer, more focused. "Still here," he observed, his voice stronger. "Where else would we be?" Lydia asked. He studied her face in the golden light of evening. "Most folks would have taken my horse and whatever they could carry and left me for the buzzards. We're not most folks." "No," he agreed quietly. "I can see that." He managed to sit up with their help, accepting another cup of water gratefully. "How long was I out?" "Most of the day. You gave us quite a scare." Truett looked around at their makeshift camp, taking in their patched wagon, their modest supplies, the careful way they'd arranged everything to care for him. "You folks are traveling light." "We travel with what we need," Lydia replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "And where exactly are you heading?" "Land grant about 30 miles west of here, near a place called Bitter Springs." Something flickered across Truett's face of surprise, concern, or perhaps something else entirely. "Bitter Springs," he repeated slowly. "You know it." "I know it." He was quiet for a long moment, seeming to wrestle with some internal decision. "Mrs. Weatherall, that land you're heading to claim, who told you about it?" "Patrick Murphy, back in Roswell. Said it was good grazing land, just needed someone willing to work it." Truett's expression grew grave. "Patrick Murphy." He shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Patrick Murphy's been dead these past 2 years. Died of consumption in Albuquerque." The words hit Lydia like a physical blow. "That's impossible. We spoke with him just 3 weeks ago. He had all the papers." "Whatever papers you saw, they weren't legitimate." Truett's voice was gentle but firm. "And that land at Bitter Springs, it's not fit for grazing. Alkali soil, bad water. Nothing grows there but hardpan and disappointment." Lydia felt the world tilting beneath her. Their entire plan, their hope for a fresh start, the last of their money spent on supplies for this journey, built on a lie. She put her hand to her belly, feeling the child stir as if sensing her distress. "Ma?" Caleb's voice was tight with worry. She forced herself to breathe, to think. They'd been swindled, but they were still alive, still together. That was what mattered. "We'll figure something out," she said, though she had no idea what. Truett was watching her carefully. "You're not the first family to fall for that particular swindle. There's been others folks looking for a new start, willing to believe in promises of cheap land and easy living. What happened to them? Some turned around, went back where they came from. Others," he shrugged, "the desert keeps its own counsel." The implications of their situation began to sink in. They had enough supplies for perhaps another week, not enough money to return to Roswell, even if they wanted to face the debts and shame waiting there. And winter was coming, not the brutal winters of the north, but cold enough to be dangerous for a pregnant woman and 2 boys living rough. "Mr. Truett," she said carefully, "you mentioned you know this country well. Is there anywhere we might find honest work? Somewhere I could deliver this child safely?" Truett studied her for a long moment, his pale eyes unreadable. Finally, he said, "Mrs. Weatherall, you and your boys saved my life today. That means something to me, more than you might realize. I'd like to repay that debt." "We don't need charity." "It's not charity. It's fairness." He struggled to his feet, swaying only slightly. "My ranch is about 2 days' ride south of here. Good water, decent shelter. I could use help with the books. I'm not much for figures, and my regular accountant is getting on in years. Your boy Caleb looks like he has a good head for numbers." Caleb straightened with pride. "I can read and cipher just fine, sir. And young Ezra here has a gentle way with animals. I noticed how he approached my horse. Careful, respectful. That's a skill worth cultivating." Ezra blushed, but stood taller. "What exactly are you proposing?" Lydia asked, though part of her already knew she had little choice but to listen. "Come to my place. Help me get my affairs in order. Stay through the winter. Let that baby of yours be born somewhere safe and warm. Come spring, if you're not satisfied with the arrangement, I'll stake you to better land legitimately purchased, with clear title and enough supplies to get started right." It was a generous offer, perhaps too generous. Lydia had learned to be suspicious of men who promised easy solutions to complicated problems. "And what would you get out of this arrangement?" Truett's smile was rueful. "Company, Mrs. Weatherall. I'm an old man with no family and few friends. My ranch is big and empty, and I'm tired of rattling around in it alone." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "And perhaps the chance to do something decent for once, instead of just profitable." There was something in his voice, a loneliness that matched her own, a weariness that spoke of regrets accumulated over decades. Despite everything she'd heard about Elias Truett's ruthless business practices, the man sitting before her seemed genuinely grateful for their kindness and sincere in his offer. "Ma," Caleb said quietly, "might be we should consider it. Winter's coming, and we got to think about." He glanced meaningfully at her belly. Ezra nodded agreement. "And his horse does seem to like people. That says something about a man, doesn't it?" Lydia looked at her sons, both trying so hard to be men, to shoulder responsibilities that should have remained hers. They were right, of course. Pride was a luxury they couldn't afford, not with winter approaching and a baby coming. "All right, Mr. Truett," she said finally. "We accept your offer, but I want it understood that we're not charity cases. We'll earn our keep. I wouldn't expect anything less." Truett extended his hand, and she shook it, noting the strength still in his grip despite his recent ordeal. "Partners, then." "Partners," she agreed, though she suspected the arrangement would prove more complicated than either of them imagined. As they prepared to make camp for the night, Truett insisting he was well enough to travel, but agreeing to wait until morning, Lydia found herself studying this man who had so suddenly become central to their survival. There were depths to Elias Truett that his reputation didn't capture, kindnesses that his business dealings had never revealed. But there were shadows there too, secrets that flickered behind his pale eyes when he thought no one was watching. As she settled her sons for the night and prepared to keep watch over their unexpected guest, Lydia wondered what exactly they were getting themselves into. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice carrying across the vast emptiness of the desert. It sounded lonely, she thought, and somehow appropriate for this strange turn their journey had taken. Tomorrow they would head south, toward Elias Truett's ranch and an uncertain future. But tonight, they were alive and together, and sometimes that had to be enough. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Lydia of better times. She'd kept the final watch, letting Caleb and Ezra sleep while she monitored Truett's condition through the darkest hours. The rancher's breathing had remained steady, his color improving with each hour of rest and careful hydration. "Mrs. Weatherall," Truett's voice was stronger this morning, though still rough around the edges, "I owe you more than I can properly express." "You owe us nothing, Mr. Truett. Anyone would have done the same." "No," he said, sitting up carefully and accepting the cup of coffee Caleb offered. "Most wouldn't have stopped. Fewer still would have stayed." He sipped the coffee, noting its weakness but making no complaint. "This is good. Haven't had coffee made with care in longer than I care to remember." Ezra was already seeing to Truett's horse, speaking softly to the animal as he checked its legs and hooves for signs of strain. The gelding responded to the boy's gentle touch, lowering its head to nuzzle his shoulder. "He has a gift," Truett observed, watching Ezra work. "His father always said Ezra could charm a rattlesnake into singing hymns," Lydia replied, then immediately regretted mentioning Benjamin. The pain of his loss still caught her unexpectedly sometimes. "What happened to your husband, if you don't mind my asking?" "Apache raid, 2 years ago. He was riding with a supply train out of Fort Sumner." She kept her voice steady, though the familiar ache settled in her chest. "They brought his body home, but not much else." Truett nodded gravely. "I knew some good men who died in those raids. The frontier takes its toll on families." "Yes, it does." She touched her belly unconsciously, thinking of the child whose father had never known of its existence. Some tolls were more complicated than others. They broke camp efficiently, Truett insisting he was well enough to ride despite Lydia's concerns. His color was better, but she could see the effort it cost him to maintain his usual authoritative bearing. Whatever had driven him to ride alone into the desert, it had pushed him beyond his physical limits. "My ranch is about 40 miles south," he explained as they prepared to travel. "We'll take it easy, stop when we need to. No sense risking another collapse." "Mr. Truett," Caleb said respectfully, "might I ask what you were doing out there alone? Seems like a man in your position would travel with help." Truett's expression grew distant. "Sometimes a man needs to think, son, and sometimes thinking requires solitude." He paused, adjusting his hat against the morning sun. I was visiting a grave, an old friend who died too young, got caught up in memories and forgot to pay attention to the sun. The explanation felt incomplete, but Lydia sensed there were depths to Elias Truett's story that he wasn't ready to share. Everyone carried private sorrows, and she respected his right to keep his own counsel. The journey south revealed the true scope of Truett's holdings. Mile after mile of rangeland stretched in all directions, marked occasionally by line shacks and windmills that spoke of careful management and substantial investment. Cattle moved like dark spots across the grassland, attended by riders who raised their hands in greeting when they spotted Truett. "How much land do you own?" Ezra asked, with the directness of youth. "Enough," Truett replied. "Been building this spread for 30 years, piece by piece. Some bought fair, some homesteaded, some claimed by right of improvement." His voice carried a hint of pride mixed with something that might have been regret. As they traveled, Lydia found herself studying this man, who had so abruptly become central to their future. There was an easiness about him when he spoke to her sons, a patience that surprised her given his reputation for hardness in business dealings. He answered Caleb's questions about cattle management with careful detail and praised Ezra's observations about the horses they encountered. But she also noticed the way his hand occasionally pressed to his chest, how he favored his left side when he thought no one was watching. Whatever condition had contributed to his collapse wasn't entirely resolved by their care. The thought troubled her what would happen to their arrangement if his health failed entirely. By midday, they could see buildings on the horizon. The Truett ranch house sat like a fortress in the midst of the vast grassland, a 2-story adobe structure surrounded by corrals, barns, and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and permanence. It was larger than any private home Lydia had ever seen, with wide verandas and tall windows that promised cool interiors and comfortable living. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "It's lonely," Truett replied, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him more closely. As they approached the main gate, riders began converging on their location. Ranch hands, drawn by curiosity about their employer's unexpected return with strangers. Lydia could feel the weight of their stares, the questions they were too respectful to voice directly. "Boss?" A weathered man with a graying beard rode up beside them. "We were getting worried. You've been gone 3 days." "I'm fine, Miguel. Just took longer than expected." Truett gestured toward Lydia and the boys. "This is Mrs. Weatherall and her sons. They'll be staying with us for a while." Miguel's expression remained carefully neutral, but Lydia caught the quick exchange of glances between him and the other hands. News traveled fast on the frontier, and the arrival of a pregnant woman and her children at the bachelor ranch of Elias Truett would be the subject of considerable speculation. "See that they're made comfortable," Truett continued. "Mrs. Weatherall will need suitable quarters, and the boys will be helping around the ranch." "Si, patron, whatever you say." But Lydia could hear the questions Miguel didn't ask, could see them reflected in the faces of the other men. She straightened her shoulders, meeting their curious stares directly. She'd faced worse than gossip before. The ranch house interior was even more impressive than its exterior promised. Wide hallways, high ceilings, and furniture that spoke of taste and substantial expense. But it felt oddly empty, like a stage set waiting for actors who never arrived. "I'll have Rosa prepare rooms for you," Truett said, referring to a middle-aged Mexican woman who had appeared to greet them. "Mrs. Weatherall, you'll want the guest suite on the first floor, I think. Easier with your condition. Mr. Truett, we don't need anything fancy." "You need what you need," he said firmly, "and I need to know my guests are comfortable." Rosa bustled about with efficient warmth, clearly pleased to have people to care for beyond the solitary rancher. She spoke a mixture of Spanish and English, her hands gesturing expressively as she described the arrangements she would make. "She's been with me 15 years, Truett explained. "Keeps this place from falling down around my ears. Her husband, Carlos, manages the horse breeding operation." The guest suite was larger than the entire cabin Lydia's family had occupied back in Roswell. A sitting room, bedroom and private bath, with actual running water luxuries she hadn't enjoyed since before her marriage to Benjamin. "This is too much," she protested. "This is what I have to offer," Truett replied, "and I'd be pleased if you'd accept it." That evening, they shared dinner in a dining room that could have seated 20 people comfortably. The table was set with china and crystal that caught the lamplight, and Rosa served them a meal that was simple but elegantly prepared. "Tell me about your sons," Truett said as they ate. "What are their interests, their skills?" Lydia spoke about Caleb's aptitude for numbers and reading, his sense of responsibility that sometimes seemed too heavy for his years. About Ezra's way with animals and his artistic eye for seeing beauty in simple things. "And what about you, Mrs. Weatherall? What were you before the frontier claimed you?" "A teacher, originally, before I married Benjamin." She touched the simple gold band she still wore, a reflexive gesture when speaking of her past. "I taught at a small school in Missouri until the war changed everything." "And after?" "After, I became whatever I needed to be. Nurse, seamstress, bookkeeper, farmer's wife." She paused, considering her words. "The frontier teaches you that survival matters more than propriety." Truett nodded approvingly. "Practical wisdom. Too many people come west expecting life to accommodate their preferences instead of adapting to what life requires." Later, as she settled her sons in their shared room larger than their entire previous home, Caleb voiced the question she knew had been troubling him. "Ma, what exactly are we doing here? This man, he's got more money than most towns. Why does he want to help us?" "Sometimes people do kind things because they can, Caleb. Sometimes because they remember being helped when they needed it. And sometimes because they want something in return," Ezra added with insight that surprised her. "Yes," she agreed, "sometimes that too, but we'll deal with whatever comes. We always have." But even as she said it, Lydia wondered what exactly Elias Truett expected from their arrangement. His kindness seemed genuine, but men of his stature rarely acted without calculating the benefits. And there had been something in his eyes when he looked at her sons, a hunger that might have been paternal longing or something else entirely. Outside her window, she could hear the night sounds of the ranch cattle lowing in the distance, horses moving in the corrals, the murmur of voices from the bunkhouse. It was peaceful, prosperous, the kind of life she dreamed of providing for her children. But as she lay in the finest bed she'd ever occupied, Lydia found sleep elusive. Change had come so suddenly, their circumstances altered so dramatically, that she felt unmoored from her own life. 3 days ago, they'd been desperate travelers heading toward what they thought was salvation. Now they were guests, perhaps something more, at one of the territory's grandest ranches. She touched her wedding ring again, thinking of Benjamin and the simpler certainties of their life together. He would have been suspicious of Truett's generosity, would have insisted on understanding the terms clearly before accepting such hospitality. But Benjamin was dead, and she was alive with 2 sons to raise and a 3rd child coming. Sometimes survival required accepting help from unexpected sources, even when the full cost remained unclear. In the morning, she decided, she would begin earning their keep in earnest. She would prove to Elias Truett and to herself that the Weatherall family was worthy of whatever opportunities this strange Providence had provided. The ranch house settled into nighttime, quiet around her, but somewhere in its depths she could hear footsteps pacing back and forth, as if someone else found sleep equally elusive. Perhaps Elias Truett was discovering that having guests was more complicated than he'd anticipated. Or perhaps, like her, he was wondering what exactly he'd set in motion by opening his home to a family of strangers who had saved his life in the desert. The first week at the Truett Ranch passed with the careful politeness of strangers learning to live under the same roof. Lydia rose early each morning, her pregnancy making sleep restless anyway, and found herself drawn to the kitchen where Rosa worked with quiet efficiency. "Signora Rosa doesn't mind the company," the older woman assured her in her careful English. "Es muy silencioso, this house, too quiet for too long." Lydia helped where she could, learning Rosa's routines and the particular needs of managing such a large household. The work felt good after months of uncertainty, giving her days structure and purpose beyond simply surviving. Caleb had thrown himself into ranch work with the enthusiasm of a young man eager to prove his worth. Miguel, the ranch foreman, had taken him under his wing, teaching him the intricacies of cattle management and the careful bookkeeping that kept such a large operation profitable. "Your boy, he has good head for numbers," Miguel told Lydia one morning as they watched Caleb working with the ranch's ledgers. "And he listens. Some young men, they think they know everything already." "His father always said Caleb was born with an old soul," Lydia replied, pride evident in her voice. Ezra had found his place among the horses, working with Carlos to gentle the young stock and maintain the breeding records. The boy had an intuitive understanding of the animals that impressed even the experienced vaqueros. "He reads horses like books," Carlos observed, watching Ezra work with a skittish colt. "The horses, they trust him. Is a gift, this thing." But it was Elias Truett's relationship with her sons that surprised Lydia most. The man who was reputed to be ruthless in business showed infinite patience with Caleb's questions about ranch management, spending long evenings teaching him the complexities of land rights, water claims, and cattle breeding. "Business isn't just about making money," she overheard him telling Caleb one evening. "It's about building something that lasts, something that matters beyond your own lifetime." With Ezra, Truett was gentler still, encouraging the boy's artistic observations and listening seriously to his ideas about improving the horse's living conditions. He'd even provided Ezra with paper and pencils, encouraging him to sketch the animals he worked with. "Art isn't frivolous," he told the boy when Ezra expressed embarrassment about his drawings. "Understanding beauty, capturing it, that's a skill that serves a man well in any profession." Lydia found these interactions both touching and troubling. Truett's affection for her sons seemed genuine, but she worried about them becoming too attached to a situation that might not prove permanent. And there was something almost desperate in the way the older man sought their company, as if he were trying to fill some long empty space in his life. One evening, as she sat in the library working on correspondence for Truett's business, a Fairshire teaching background, making her useful for such tasks, she discovered him reading from a worn Bible that had belonged to Caleb's father. "I hope you don't mind," Truett said, noticing her surprise. "Caleb mentioned it was his father's. I haven't read scripture in many years." "Of course I don't mind. Benjamin would have been pleased to know his Bible was being put to good use." Truett closed the book carefully, running his fingers over its worn leather cover. "Your husband was a believer then?" "Very much so. He said faith was what got him through the war, and through the hard times after." She paused in her writing. "What about you, Mr. Truett? Are you a religious man?" "I was once. Lost my way somewhere along the path to prosperity." His voice carried a weight of old regret. "Seems like the more land I acquired, the further I drifted from the things that should have mattered. It's never too late to find your way back." "Maybe not." He opened the Bible again, reading the inscription Benjamin had written on the flyleaf. "For my sons, that they might always remember what matters most isn't what a man owns, but how he treats his fellow travelers on this earthly journey." "Your husband was a wise man." "Yes, he was. I wish my sons had more time to learn from him." "They're learning still. Wisdom has a way of passing down, even when the teacher is gone." Truett looked at her thoughtfully. "You're doing well by them, Mrs. Weatherall. They're becoming fine young men." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. In the weeks since Benjamin's death, she'd often questioned her decisions, wondered if she was providing her sons with adequate guidance for becoming men. Truett's approval carried weight, was clearly a man who understood what it took to succeed in this harsh country. But success for Elias Truett had apparently come at a personal cost. The ranch house, for all its grandeur, felt hollow in places where a family's presence should have brought warmth. There were no children's drawings on the walls, no family portraits beyond a few formal photographs of stern-faced relatives, no sense that laughter and affection had ever filled these rooms. "Mr. Truett," she said carefully, "might I ask why you never married, built a family of your own?" His smile was rueful. I was married. Once. Long time ago. When I was young and thought I could have everything I wanted if I just worked hard enough. He stared out the window at the vast expanse of his holdings. Turned out I was half right. I could have everything I wanted, or I could have what mattered most. Couldn't figure out how to have both. What happened? She left. Said she was tired of competing with cattle and land for my attention. Said she wanted a husband, not a business partner. He was quiet for a moment. She was right, of course. By the time I realized it, she'd already married someone else. Someone who knew how to put family first. I'm sorry. So was I, still am, truth be told. He closed the Bible and stood. That's why your boys mean something to me, Mrs. Weatherall. They remind me of what I might have had if I'd made different choices. The conversation troubled Lydia long after Truett had retired to his study. There was a loneliness in the man that went deeper than simple solitude, a hunger for connection that her family seemed to be filling in ways that might not be healthy for any of them. She was still thinking about it the next morning when a rider approached the ranch at full gallop, his urgency evident in the way he pushed his horse. Miguel met him at the gate, and their conversation carried the sharp tones of concern. "What is it?" Lydia asked Rosa, who had stepped onto the porch to observe the commotion. "Trouble, maybe. The rider. He comes from town, from the lawyer's office." Truett emerged from the house, his expression growing grave as Miguel relayed the messenger's news. Lydia couldn't hear the words, but the tension in the rancher's shoulders told her it was serious. "Mrs. Weatherall," Truett called, approaching the porch with deliberate calm. "I need to ride into Las Cruces. Business matter that requires immediate attention. I'd be obliged if you'd keep an eye on things here." "Of course. Is there anything we can do to help?" "Just what you're already doing. Taking care of this place, these people." He paused, glancing back at Miguel, who was already preparing horses. "There may be some folks coming around asking questions about you and the boys, about your business being here." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that aren't really their business to ask. If anyone gives you trouble, send them to Miguel. He knows how to handle curious neighbors." The warning sent a chill through Lydia. "Mr. Truett, are we causing problems for you? Because if we are—" "No." His voice was firm. "You're not causing anything. But word travels fast in small communities, and some people have nothing better to do than speculate about other folks' affairs." He softened his tone. "Don't worry about it, Mrs. Weatherall. I'll handle whatever needs handling." But as she watched him ride away, Lydia felt the first stirrings of real concern. They'd been living in a kind of protected bubble at the ranch, sheltered from the outside world's judgments and complications. If that protection was beginning to crack, she needed to prepare herself and her sons for whatever consequences might follow. That afternoon, as if summoned by Truett's warning, visitors arrived. 2 women from Las Cruces, dressed in their Sunday best and wearing expressions of determined righteousness. "We're here to call on Mrs. Weatherall." The older of the 2 announced to Rosa, who had answered their knock. "I'm Mrs. Catherine Morrison, president of the Ladies' Auxiliary. This is Mrs. Helen Cartwright." Lydia presented herself in the parlor, acutely aware of her condition and the questions it would raise. Mrs. Morrison's sharp eyes took immediate inventory, the fine surroundings, Lydia's pregnancy, the obvious prosperity of her current situation. "Mrs. Weatherall, we've heard about your arrangement with Mr. Truett. The community is naturally concerned about the propriety of the situation." "I'm not sure what you mean," Lydia replied carefully. "A woman in your condition, living unchaperoned in the home of a bachelor. Surely you can understand how that might appear to decent people." The implication stung, as it was meant to. Lydia drew herself up straighter. "My sons and I are Mr. Truett's invited guests. I'm helping with his business correspondence, and my boys are learning ranch work. I fail to see what concern that is to anyone else." Mrs. Cartwright leaned forward. "Perhaps you don't understand how things work in this territory, dear. Mr. Truett is an important man, and his reputation affects the entire community. We simply can't have him subjected to unfortunate gossip." "What exactly are you suggesting?" "That perhaps you'd be more comfortable in town," Mrs. Morrison said smoothly. We could help you find suitable lodgings, somewhere more appropriate for a woman in your circumstances. The offer was clearly less about her comfort than about removing what they saw as a source of scandal. Lydia felt her temper rising but forced herself to remain calm. "That's very kind, but I'm quite comfortable here. Mr. Truett has been nothing but a gentleman, and my situation is entirely respectable." "Is it?" Mrs. Morrison's voice carried a sharp edge. "Because we've heard some interesting stories about how you came to be here, about finding Mr. Truett in the desert and nursing him back to health, almost like a fairy tale, isn't it?" The implication was clear. They suspected her of orchestrating the entire situation, of deliberately placing herself in Truett's path to take advantage of him. Lydia felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "Sometimes reality is stranger than fairy tales, Mrs. Morrison. Good deeds do sometimes have good consequences." "Indeed they do, but people will wonder about your motives, dear, especially given your delicate condition. A pregnant widow, alone with 2 children, suddenly living in luxury at the territory's richest ranch. You can see how that might raise questions." Before Lydia could respond, Caleb appeared in the doorway. Her son had grown taller in the weeks at the ranch, his shoulders broader from physical work, but his face still held the protective fury of a boy defending his mother. "Ma, is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, Caleb. These ladies were just leaving." Mrs. Morrison rose stiffly. "We certainly were, but Mrs. Weatherall, I hope you'll consider what we've discussed, for your own sake, and for the sake of your children." After they left, Lydia found herself shaking with anger and something that felt uncomfortably like shame. She'd done nothing wrong, but the women's accusations had found their mark. The truth was, their situation was unusual and would be subject to exactly the kind of speculation the ladies had voiced. "Ma," Caleb said quietly, "what did they want?" "To remind me that people talk, son, and that sometimes they talk about things that aren't their business. Are we going to have to leave?" The question broke her heart a little. Caleb had found his place here, was learning skills that would serve him well in life. Ezra was happier than she'd seen him since his father's death. And she was growing comfortable in ways that perhaps she shouldn't allow herself. "I don't know, Caleb, but whatever happens, we'll face it together. We always have." That evening, when Truett returned from town, his expression was grim but determined. "I heard about your visitors," he said without preamble. "Rosa told me. I'm sorry if we've caused you embarrassment. The only thing that embarrasses me is having neighbors who think it's their business to police my hospitality." His voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before. "Mrs. Weatherall, I want you to know that you and your boys are welcome here for as long as you choose to stay. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." His support meant more than she could easily express, but it also made her realize how dependent they'd become on his protection. And protection that could be given could also be withdrawn, leaving them more vulnerable than they'd been before. The monsoon season arrived early that year, trapping them all within the comfortable confines of the ranch house as rain drummed against the windows and turned the usually hard-packed earth into treacherous mud. For Lydia, the enforced intimacy felt both blessing and cursite, allowed her family to grow closer to Elias Truett, but also made their dependence on his generosity more apparent with each passing day. It was during these rain-soaked evenings that she truly began to understand the depth of Truett's loneliness. He would sit in his favorite chair by the fireplace, a book in his hands, but his eyes often distant, watching her sons with an expression that mixed joy and sorrow in equal measure. "Tell me about your father," he said to Caleb one evening as they worked together on the ranch's financial records. The ledgers were spread across the dining room table, and Truett was teaching the boy the intricacies of profit margins and seasonal planning. "He was a good man," Caleb replied carefully. "Fair but firm. He believed a man's word was his bond, and that hard work was its own reward." "Sounds like someone I would have liked to know." "He would have liked you too, sir. He always said you could judge a man by how he treated people who couldn't do anything for him." Truett looked up from the ledger, studying Caleb's earnest face. "And what's your judgment of me, son?" The question surprised Caleb, but he answered with the honesty that had always been his nature. I think you're a good man who maybe forgot that for a while, but you're remembering now. The simple assessment seemed to affect Truett more than any elaborate praise might have. He was quiet for a long moment before returning to the numbers, but Lydia noticed how his hand trembled slightly as he turned the page. With Ezra, Truett showed a different kind of attention. The boy's artistic nature seemed to awaken something in the older man, an appreciation for beauty that his business dealings had long suppressed. "Look at this," Ezra said one rainy afternoon, showing Truett a sketch he'd made of the horses in the stable. "See how the light hits their coats? It's like they're made of different kinds of metal, bronze and copper and silver." Truett studied the drawing with serious attention. "You've captured something there, boy. Something most folks would walk right past without seeing. Ma says I see things different than other people. Different isn't bad, Ezra. Different is what makes art possible, what makes any kind of creation possible." Truett handed back the sketch. "Don't let anyone convince you that seeing beauty is a weakness. The world needs people who notice what others miss." But it was during the long evening conversations that Lydia felt herself most drawn into Truett's orbit. After the boys had gone to bed, they would sit in the library, sometimes working on ranch correspondence, sometimes simply talking about life, loss, and the strange paths that had brought them together. "I never expected to be a father," he confided one night as rain lashed the windows. "Always thought there would be time for family later, after I'd built something solid, after I'd proven myself. And now I'm 66 years old, and I realize that proving yourself to the world means nothing if you haven't got anyone who matters to share it with." He gestured toward the stairs where her sons slept. "Those boys of yours, they've shown me what I missed, what I threw away chasing after things that don't warm your bed or hold your hand when you're dying." The vulnerability in his voice stirred something in Lydia that she'd thought buried with Benjamin. Not love, exactly, but a recognition of kindred loneliness, of lives that had taken unexpected turns. "It's not too late," she said gently. "You're still here, still able to make different choices." "Am I? Sometimes I think I'm too set in my ways, too accustomed to putting business before everything else." He looked at her directly. "But having you here, all of you's changed something, made me remember what a home should feel like." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to address. Lydia felt the dangerous pull of possibility, the temptation to let herself imagine a future that might offer security and companionship for her growing family. It was then that Truett surprised her by reaching into his vest pocket and withdrawing a small wooden carving. The work was rough but careful, clearly the product of many evenings' patient effort. "I've been making this," he said almost shyly, "for the baby. Thought every child should have something made special just for them." The carving was a horse, small enough to fit in an infant's hand, but detailed enough to show the care that had gone into its creation. The wood was smooth from sanding, safe for small fingers to explore. "Elias," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. "It's beautiful. Figured since the baby's going to grow up around horses, might as well start early with the introductions." His smile was uncertain, vulnerable in a way that made him seem decades younger. "Course, I don't know if it's going to be a boy or girl, so I tried to make it general enough." The gift touched her more deeply than grand gestures might have. The thought of this powerful, successful man spending his evenings whittling a toy for her unborn child spoke to a tenderness she hadn't suspected he possessed. "What should we call it?" she asked, turning the little horse in her hands. "Whatever feels right when the time comes. Names have a way of choosing themselves, I've found." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the wooden horse resting in Lydia's palm like a promise of gentler possibilities. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion, but inside the warmth of the library, the storm felt distant and manageable. "Lydia," Truett said eventually, her name soft on his lips, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "The child you're carrying, will you tell me about the father?" The question she'd been dreading finally came, and she found herself surprisingly ready to answer honestly. "His name was Thomas Brennan. He was passing through Roswell, helped us repair our roof after a storm." She kept her voice steady, matter of fact. He was kind to the boys, respectful to me. I was lonely, grieving, not thinking clearly about consequences. Do you regret it? She considered the question seriously. I regret the circumstances, the loneliness that led to it, the complications it's created. But I can't regret the child. Every life is a gift, even if it comes wrapped in difficult circumstances. And the father, does he know? He was gone before dawn, never saw him again. She touched her belly, feeling the child stir as if responding to their conversation. This baby will have to be content with the family it has. Truett nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the one we're born with. Is that what you think we are? A chosen family? I'd like to think so, if you'd have me. The words hung between them, heavier than any formal proposal might have been. Lydia felt the weight of decision pressing down on her, not just for herself, but for her sons and the child yet to be born. Elias, she said carefully, what exactly are you asking? I'm asking if you might consider staying. Permanently, not as guests or employees, but as family. His voice grew stronger, more certain. I know it's unconventional. I know people will talk, but I also know that I've been more alive these past weeks than I have in 20 years. And my sons would be my sons too, if they'd have me. I'd see them educated, established, given every opportunity to build whatever lives they choose. He leaned forward, his pale eyes intense. I'm not talking about charity, Lydia. I'm talking about family, real family, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. The offer was everything she'd hoped for and feared in equal measure. Security for her children, a father figure for the baby, an end to the constant uncertainty that had defined their lives since Benjamin's death. But it was also a surrender of independence, an acceptance of dependence that went against every instinct she'd developed as a widow. I need time to think, she said finally. Of course, this isn't a decision to be made lightly. He stood, but paused at the door. But Lydia, don't take too long. The world has a way of changing around us while we're busy thinking. After he left, she sat alone in the library, the wooden horse still warm in her palm. Through the windows, she could see lightning illuminating the vast expanse of Truett's holdings land that could be her son's inheritance, security that could protect them from the uncertainties that had driven them to this point. But she could also hear Benjamin's voice in her memory, warning her about accepting help that came with strings attached, about the importance of standing on your own feet even when the ground felt unsteady beneath them. The next morning brought a break in the weather and an unexpected visitor. Dr. Samuel Hayes rode up to the ranch house just as the family was finishing breakfast, his medical bag tied securely behind his saddle. Mrs. Weatherall, he said, removing his hat as Rosa showed him into the dining room. Mr. Truett sent word that you might benefit from a medical examination. Given your condition and the rustic nature of your recent travels, Truett looked slightly embarrassed. I thought it wise to have someone qualified check on you and the baby. Dr. Hayes has been tending folks in this territory for 30 years. The examination was thorough but gentle, conducted in the privacy of her room with Rosa serving as chaperone. Hayes was a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and hands that had clearly delivered many babies under frontier conditions. You're in excellent health, Mrs. Weatherall, he announced when the examination was complete. The baby appears to be developing normally, and I'd estimate you have perhaps 6 weeks remaining until delivery. 6 weeks? The timeline surprised her. It seemed both too long and not nearly long enough for all the decisions that needed to be made. Perhaps a bit less. First babies can be unpredictable, but this isn't your first, is it? No, I have 2 sons. Then you know what to expect. I'll plan to check on you again in a few weeks, and you should send for me immediately if you experience any unusual symptoms. As Dr. Hayes prepared to leave, he spoke privately with Truett on the veranda. Lydia couldn't hear their conversation, but she saw the serious expressions on both men's faces, the way they glanced toward her window. Later, when the doctor had gone, Truett seemed unusually subdued. "Is everything all right?" she asked. The doctor seemed concerned about something. He's concerned about timing, Truett replied carefully. Winter comes early to this country, and travel becomes difficult if complications arise during delivery. You're worried I won't be able to leave if I want to. I'm worried you'll feel trapped into staying. His honesty surprised her. Most men in his position would have been pleased to have circumstances working in their favor, but Truett seemed genuinely troubled by the possibility that weather might force her decision. And you don't want me to stay under those conditions. I want you to stay because you choose to, not because you have no other option. He looked out at the mountains, already showing traces of early snow on their peaks. A family built on necessity isn't really a family at all. That afternoon, while Caleb worked with Miguel and Ezra tended the horses, Lydia found herself alone with her thoughts and the growing certainty that a decision couldn't be postponed much longer. The child moved restlessly within her, as if sensing the uncertainty of its future. She was sitting in the garden, enjoying the brief sunshine between storms, when a rider approached at a leisurely pace. The man was well-dressed but dusty from travel, and something about his bearing suggested he wasn't a casual visitor. Mrs. Weatherall, he dismounted and approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. I'm James Morrison, Mrs. Catherine Morrison's husband. I believe my wife paid you a visit recently. Yes, she did. Lydia remained seated, instinctively wary. I hope you'll forgive the directness, but I felt I should speak with you personally about your situation here. Morrison's smile was practiced, the kind politicians and lawyers used when delivering unpleasant news. There are certain legal considerations that might not have been fully explained to you. What kind of legal considerations? Well, for instance, the question of legitimacy. Your child, when it's born without a husband to claim it, the law is quite specific about inheritance rights. Bastard children have no legal standing in matters of property transfer. The crude term hit her like a slap, but she forced herself to remain calm. I'm not sure why that would concern you, Mr. Morrison. Because Elias Truett is not a young man, Mrs. Weatherall. His health is uncertain, and there are parties with legitimate claims to his estate should something happen to him. Morrison's voice took on a harder edge. Claims that supersede any emotional attachments he might form. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you of realities, legal realities that could become very unpleasant if you're not prepared for them. He glanced toward the house, where Truett could be seen through a window. My clients simply want to ensure that everyone understands their position clearly. Your clients? Let's just say that Mr. Truett's apparent lack of direct heirs has attracted attention from various quarters, people who want to be certain that his considerable assets don't fall into inappropriate hands. Before Lydia could respond, Truett emerged from the house, his expression darkening as he recognized Morrison. James, what brings you to my ranch uninvited? Business, Elias. The kind that affects all of us in this territory. Morrison's tone remained smooth, but tension crackled between the two men. I was just explaining to Mrs. Weatherall some of the legal complexities surrounding inheritance law. Were you? How thoughtful. Truett's voice carried a dangerous edge. Perhaps you'd care to explain why my legal affairs are any concern of yours. When they affect the stability of the entire region's economy, they become everyone's concern. Morrison remounted his horse, clearly satisfied that he'd delivered his message. Mrs. Weatherall, I hope you'll consider carefully what we've discussed. For everyone's sake. After Morrison left, Truett's anger was palpable but controlled. What did he say to you? Lydia repeated the conversation, watching Truett's expression grow grimmer with each detail. The bastards, he said quietly. They're circling like vultures already, trying to frighten you away before I can make any legal arrangements. Legal arrangements? Adoption papers for the boys, marriage if you'll have me, legitimization of the child through marriage before birth. His voice grew fierce. Whatever it takes to ensure that you and your family are protected, legally and practically. The proposal for, that's what it was came, not with romance, but with the urgency of practical necessity. Lydia felt the weight of decision pressing down harder than ever. Elias, You can't marry me just to spite your enemies. I'm not. I'm marrying you because I love your sons as if they were my own blood, because I already love that unborn child like my own grandchild, and because," he paused, vulnerability flickering across his features, "because I've come to love you, Lydia, not as a convenience or a solution to loneliness, but as the woman who brought life back into this empty house." The admission hung between them, honest and unadorned. Lydia felt her heart racing, torn between the practical wisdom of accepting his protection and the fear of trading one form of dependence for another. "I need to talk to my sons," she said finally. "Of course, this affects them too." That evening, she gathered Caleb and Ezra in her room and explained the situation as simply and honestly as she could. Their reactions surprised her. "Ma," Caleb said seriously, "Mr. Truett's been more of a father to us these past weeks than most men are to their own blood. If he wants to make it official, I say we'd be fools to refuse." Ezra nodded agreement, "And he whittled that horse for the baby. That's not something a man does unless he really cares." Their easy acceptance of Truett as a father figure both warmed and worried her. But looking at their faces more confident and settled than they'd been since Benjamin's death, she realized that her decision affected more than just her own future. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains, promising more storms to come. But inside the warm circle of her family's love and Truett's growing affection, Lydia began to believe that some storms were worth weathering together. The forged land deed arrived on a crisp October morning, delivered by a nervous clerk from the Territorial Land Office who seemed eager to complete his business and depart. Lydia watched from the kitchen window as Truett examined the document, his expression growing darker with each line he read. "What is it?" she asked. When he entered the house, the paper crumpled in his fist. "Trouble," he replied grimly. "Someone's filed a claim on my northern pastures, says they have documentation proving prior ownership." The document, when smoothed out on the dining table, looked official, enough proper stamps, territorial seals, even aged paper that suggested it had been filed years earlier. But Truett's experienced eye caught details that marked it as a forgery. "See here," he pointed to a section of legal description. "This boundary marker was destroyed in the flood of '89 and never replaced. And this surveyor," he tapped another line. "Henry Mackenzie died in '91. He couldn't have certified anything in '92. Caleb studied the document with the careful attention Truett had taught him. "But it looks real, sir. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make it seem legitimate." "Professional work," Truett agreed. "Which means this isn't some random land grab. Someone's organizing this, planning it carefully." The implications were sobering. If one section of Truett's holdings could be challenged with forged documents, others might follow. The vast ranch that had taken 30 years to build could be dismantled piece by piece through legal challenges that would take years and thousands of dollars to fight. "Who would do such a thing?" Lydia asked. "Could be anyone. I've made enemies over the years, competitors I've outbid, smaller ranchers who lost water rights, Eastern investors who felt I got the better of them in deals." Truett's voice carried the weight of old regrets. "When you build an empire by being smarter and tougher than the next man, you collect grudges along the way." Miguel appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Patron, we have visitors. 3 men, riding hard from the direction of Las Cruces." Through the window, they could see the riders approaching, well-dressed men on good horses, clearly not casual visitors. The lead rider was a tall, distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Edward Kensington," Truett muttered, recognizing the man. "Lawyer from Santa Fe. Expensive one, too. This is about to get interesting." Kensington dismounted with theatrical flourish, straightening his coat before approaching the house. His companions remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their sidearms in a display that was meant to intimidate without being overtly threatening. "Elias," Kensington called out with false bonhomie, "good to see you looking well. I trust you received the documentation from the land office?" "I received some papers with fancy stamps on them," Truett replied, stepping onto the porch with Lydia beside him. Can't say they impressed me much. Now, there's no need for hostility. We're all civilized men here. Kensington's eyes flicked over Lydia with obvious calculation. Mrs. Weatherall, I presume? I've heard so much about you. Nothing good, I'd imagine, Lydia replied coolly. On the contrary, everyone speaks of your devoted care for Mr. Truett. Quite touching, really. The implication in his tone made her skin crawl. State your business, Kensington, Truett said sharply. Business, yes. Well, it's quite simple, really. My clients have legitimate claims to portions of your holdings. Claims that predate your own by several years. Kensington produced a leather portfolio. I have documentation here that establishes clear title to approximately 40,000 acres of your northern range. Your clients being a consortium of investors who purchased these lands in good faith from the original Mexican grant holders. They've been quite patient about asserting their rights, but recent developments have made it necessary to move forward. The recent developments clearly referred to the possibility that Truett might legally adopt Lydia's sons or marry her, establishing heirs where none had existed before. And if I dispute these claims, then we'll settle the matter in court, naturally, though that could take years, and legal fees can be quite substantial. Kensington's smile was predatory. Of course, there might be ways to resolve this more efficiently, such as a reasonable settlement, cash payment for the affected lands. Everyone walks away satisfied. My clients are prepared to be quite generous, say, 50 cents on the dollar for the current assessed value. It was highway robbery dressed up in legal language. Truett's expression made his opinion of the offer clear. Counter. Offer, he said quietly. You and your friends get off my land before I have Miguel escort you off at gunpoint. Kensington's friendly mask slipped slightly. That would be most unwise, Elias. My clients are prepared to pursue this matter through every available legal channel. They have resources, patience, and most importantly, legitimate claims. He glanced meaningfully at Lydia. They also have concerns about irregular arrangements that might affect the estate's eventual disposition. Meaning they want to ensure that if something were to happen to you, your holdings don't fall into inappropriate hands through emotional attachments that lack legal standing. The threat was clear enough. Not only were they challenging his land titles, they were questioning his right to leave his estate to anyone he chose. Get out, Truett said, his voice deadly quiet. We'll be in touch, Kensington replied, remounting his horse. My clients are reasonable men, but their patience isn't unlimited. After the lawyers left, Truett sat heavily in his favorite chair, looking older than Lydia had seen him since their first meeting in the desert. How bad is this? She asked. Bad enough. If they can make even one of these claims stick, it establishes precedent for others. They could tie up my holdings in court for years, bleed me dry with legal fees. He rubbed his temples. And if anything happens to me during the proceedings, what about your will? Surely you can leave your property to whomever you choose. Not if there are legitimate prior claims, and not if the court decides I was mentally incompetent when I made my will. He looked at her meaningfully. A suddenly acquired family, dramatic changes in estate planning, they'll argue. I wasn't thinking clearly. The trap was elegantly constructed. By accepting Truett's protection and affection, Lydia had inadvertently provided his enemies with ammunition to use against him. Her presence, meant to bring him happiness, had instead made him vulnerable. Maybe I should leave, she said quietly. Take the boys and go before this gets worse. No, Truett's voice was firm. That's exactly what they want. They're counting on us being frightened into making emotional decisions instead of smart ones. Then what do? We fight, but we fight smart. He stood, his expression growing determined. First, I need to get my lawyer up here from El Paso. Real lawyer, not some hired gun like Kensington. Second, we need to document everything, every acre, every water right, every improvement made to this land. And third, we give them something to really worry about. Truett's smile was grim but satisfied. We get married, immediately. before they can file any more paperwork challenging my competency. The proposal came not with romance, but with the urgency of battle strategy. Lydia felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again, decisions being forced by circumstances beyond her control. Elias, I won't have you marry me just to spite your enemies. I'm not marrying you to spite anyone. I'm marrying you because I love you, and because it's the right thing to do for all of us. His voice softened. But I won't lie and say the legal benefits aren't important. Your sons need protection, and so does that baby. Marriage gives us that protection. Caleb appeared in the doorway, having clearly overheard at least part of the conversation. Ma, if Mr. Truett wants to marry you, and if it helps protect all of us, why are you hesitating? Out of the mouths of babes. Her 17-year-old son had cut straight to the heart of the matter with the practical wisdom that frontier life taught early. Because marriage should be about more than legal convenience, Caleb. But it doesn't have to be about less than that either, Truett said gently. Lydia, I'm not asking you to pretend this is some grand romance. I'm asking you to build a life with me based on mutual respect, shared responsibilities, and genuine affection. That's more than a lot of marriages start with. She looked around the room at the home that had sheltered them, at the man who had become a father to her sons, at the evidence of prosperity and security that could protect her unborn child. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was the life that circumstances had offered. All right, she said finally, but I have conditions. Name them. The boys keep their father's name unless they choose to change it. The baby takes your name since you'll be raising it. And I want legal documentation that protects their inheritance rights regardless of what happens between us. Agreed. Truett's relief was evident. Dr. Hayes can perform the ceremonies, also a justice of the peace. We can do it tomorrow if you're willing. Tomorrow? The timeline made her head spin. The sooner the better. Every day we wait gives Kensington and his clients more time to file additional challenges. Truett's expression grew serious. Lydia, I won't pretend this isn't going to be difficult. We're going to face legal battles, social disapproval, and probably more direct threats. Are you prepared for that? She thought of her sons, of the child growing within her, of the uncertain future that awaited them if they tried to face the world alone. I've faced worse, she said simply. Yes, Truett agreed. You have, and that's one of the reasons I know we can get through this together. That evening, as news of the impending marriage spread through the ranch, Lydia found herself the center of quiet congratulations from Rosa and the other household staff. Their support surprised her. She'd expected disapproval, or at least skepticism about the hasty arrangement. Es bueno, Rosa said simply. El patron, he has been alone too long. And you, Senora, you need a strong man to protect your family. You don't think it's too sudden? Love, it comes when it comes, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. But family, Rosa gestured toward the dining room, where Truett was patiently explaining a financial concept to Caleb. Family you build every day, one choice at a time. Later, as she sat in her room preparing for bed, Lydia allowed herself to imagine what married life with Elias Truett might look like. It wouldn't be the passionate romance of youth, but it could be something equally valuably. Partnership built on mutual respect and shared goals, a safe harbor for her children and the new life growing within her. Outside her window, she could see lights burning late in the bunkhouse as word of the marriage spread among the ranch hands. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new legal battles, and probably new enemies. But tonight, for the first time since Benjamin's death, she felt the possibility of genuine security for her family. The wooden horse Truett had carved still sat on her bedside table, a tangible reminder of the tenderness that lay beneath his business-hardened exterior. Whatever the future held, she was no longer facing it alone. The wedding took place at dawn on a crisp October morning, with Dr. Hayes officiating and the entire ranch serving as witnesses. Lydia wore her best dress-simple blue wool that accommodated her expanding figure, while Truett appeared in a suit that spoke of careful preparation, despite the ceremony's hasty arrangement. Standing before the small gathering of ranch hands and household staff, Lydia felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't the wedding she'd imagined as a young woman, but it was the one life had offered her, and she was determined to meet it with dignity and hope. Do you, Elias Truett, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do. Truett's voice was steady, his pale eyes focused entirely on her face. And do you, Lydia Weatherall, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death do you part? I do. The words came more easily than she'd expected, carrying with them a sense of rightness that surprised her. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle, respectful, the kiss of partners, beginning a journey rather than lovers consumed by passion. But there was warmth in it, and promise, and the suggestion that deeper affections might grow with time. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Hayes announced, I present Mr. and Mrs. Elias Truett. The celebration that followed was modest but heartfelt. Rosa had prepared a special breakfast, and Miguel had produced a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a worthy occasion. Even the ranch hands seemed genuinely pleased, perhaps understanding that their employer's happiness might translate into greater stability for all of them. But the honeymoon period was brief. Before the morning was over, riders were approaching with more legal documents, this time challenging water rights that were crucial to the ranch's operation. They're not wasting time, Truett observed grimly as he read the latest papers. Someone's coordinating this assault very carefully. The new claim involved the creek that supplied water to nearly half the ranch. Without access to that water, thousands of acres would become worthless for grazing, and the cattle operation would be severely crippled. How can they challenge water rights you've held for decades? Lydia asked. They're claiming prior usage by Mexican grant holders, saying my rights were improperly filed when the territory changed hands. Truett's expression was grim. It's legally complex enough that it could take years to resolve, and expensive enough to bankrupt most ranchers. Caleb looked up from the documents he'd been studying. But sir, didn't you say you bought some of your land directly from the original grant holders? Wouldn't you have documentation of water rights transfers? Truett paused, a slow smile spreading across his face. Son, you may have just saved us a lot of trouble. The deed transfers are in my safe in town. I never thought to bring them here because I never imagined anyone would be bold enough to challenge rights that old. Should we ride in and get them? Not we, me. Truett's expression grew serious. These people have shown they're willing to use force if necessary. I don't want you or your mother in the line of fire if this turns ugly. But Lydia had no intention of hiding while her new husband faced danger alone. Where you go, we go, she said firmly. We're family now, Elias. That means we face troubles together. The argument that followed was brief but intense. Truett wanted to protect his new family. Lydia refused to be protected at the cost of unity. In the end, they compromised. Lydia would remain at the ranch with Ezra, while Truett and Caleb rode to Las Cruces to retrieve the documents. You sure about this, Ma? Caleb asked as he prepared for the journey. Seems like we're stirring up a hornet's nest. Sometimes you have to stir up the hornets to get to the honey, she replied. Besides, we're Truetts now. That comes with responsibilities as well as benefits. As she watched her husband and eldest son ride away, Lydia felt the weight of her new role settling around her like an unfamiliar garment. She was no longer just a widow trying to protect her children. She was the wife of one of the territory's most powerful men, with all the targets that position painted on her back. The afternoon brought another visitor, this one unexpected and far more welcome. Father Miguel Santos arrived on a gentle mare, his brown Franciscan habit, dusty from travel. Senora Truett, he said with a warm smile as Rosa showed him into the parlor. I came as soon as I heard the news. Felicidades on your marriage. Thank you, Father, though I fear the timing might seem suspicious to some. Timing is in God's hands, my daughter. The heart knows what it knows, when it knows it. His kind eyes studied her carefully. But you are troubled. Is it more than the usual concerns of a new bride? Lydia found herself confiding in the priest about the legal challenges, the forged documents, and the growing sense that forces beyond their control were moving against them. Father Santos listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or murmuring understanding. "These attacks on your husband's holdings," he said when she finished, "they are not random. Someone with resources and connections is orchestrating this campaign. But who, and why now? Perhaps because now there is something to fight over that wasn't there before." He gestured toward her belly. "A potential heir changes everything, my daughter. Men who thought they might eventually benefit from a childless man's death must now consider that those benefits might pass to others." The insight chilled her. She'd been thinking of the legal challenges as attacks on Truett's business interests, but they might actually be attacks on her unborn child's future inheritance. What should we do? Pray, certainly, but also be wise as serpents while remaining innocent as doves. Father Santos's expression grew serious. There are powers moving in this territory that go beyond simple greed. Political ambitions, territorial appointments that depend on economic control. Your husband's holdings represent significant influence, and that influence will go to whoever controls his estate. You think they might try to hurt us directly? I think desperate men do desperate things, especially when legal means prove insufficient. He reached into his robes and withdrew a small wooden cross. "I brought this for the baby, but perhaps you should carry it now. Sometimes faith is the only protection we have against forces that operate in darkness." That evening, alone with Ezra and the household staff, Lydia found herself cataloguing the ranch's defenses. Miguel had left several trusted hands to guard the house, and she knew there were rifles in the gun rack and ammunition in the office. But she also knew that if determined men wanted to cause trouble, a pregnant woman and a 14-year-old boy would be poor opponents. "Ma," Ezra said as they sat by the fire after dinner, "are we safe here?" "I think so, son. Your stepfather has good men working for him, and we're not helpless ourselves." "But you're worried." "I'm cautious. There's a difference." She pulled him closer, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "We've survived hard times before, Ezra. We'll survive these too. With Pa Elias helping us." The boy had begun calling Truett Pa Elias's within days of the wedding, accepting the new family arrangement with the adaptability of youth. "Yes, with Pa Elias helping us." But as the night deepened and strange sounds carried on the wind, Lydia found herself checking the window latches and keeping one of Truett's pistols within easy reach. The ranch that had felt like a sanctuary was beginning to feel like a fortress under siege. The brand they'd hung over the fireplace, the sunrise tea that Truett had designed years ago, caught the firelight and seemed to glow with its own inner warmth. The rising sun had always symbolized hope, new beginnings, the promise that darkness would eventually give way to light. Tomorrow would bring Truett and Caleb home with the documents that might resolve their legal troubles, or it would bring new challenges that would test their resolve further. Either way, the Weatherall snow, the Truetts would face it together. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its voice carrying across the vast expanse of contested land. But inside the warm circle of family and firelight, Lydia felt the stirring of determination that had carried her family through every previous crisis. They had survived war, death, poverty, and deception. They would survive this too, because they were no longer just individuals struggling alone. They were family, bound by choice as much as circumstance, and that made them stronger than any force arrayed against them. The baby moved within her, as if responding to her thoughts, and she rested her hand on her belly with a smile. This child would be born into security and love, protected by a father who had chosen it and brothers who would defend it with their lives. Whatever tomorrow brought, the Truett family would meet it with courage, wisdom, and the unshakable bond that comes from choosing to stand together against whatever darkness threatens their light. Truett and Caleb returned the next evening with more than just the water rights documents. They brought news that would forever change how Lydia understood their family's connection to this land and to each other. "We found the papers," Truett announced as he entered the house, his face carrying an expression that mixed triumph with something deeper wonder, perhaps, or recognition of Providence at work. "And?" Lydia asked, noting the way he and Caleb exchanged meaningful glances. "And we found something else, something that explains more than just water rights." Truett set a leather portfolio on the dining table, but didn't immediately open it. "Lydia, I need to ask you something about Benjamin, about his service during the war." "What about it? Was he ever stationed near Glorietta Pass, March of '62? The question surprised her. "Yes, he was there during the big battle. He used to say it was the worst fighting he ever saw. Why?" Truett's hands trembled slightly as he opened the portfolio and withdrew a blood-stained letter, the paper brown with age and carefully preserved, despite its obvious trauma. "Because of this," he said quietly. "I've carried this letter for 25 years, never knowing the full name of the man who saved my life." Lydia took the letter with growing amazement, recognizing Benjamin's careful handwriting even before she read the words. "Captain Truett, the surgeon says you'll live, but it was a near thing. That rebel sharpshooter had you dead to rights before I could get a shot off. Glad I was quick enough. Your boys fought well today. Tell them," Sergeant Weatherall said, "they've got sand. Get well soon. We need good officers. B. Weatherall, Company C, Honest New Mexico Volunteers." "Benjamin saved your life," she whispered, the full implications beginning to dawn on her. "Took a bullet in the shoulder doing it," Truett confirmed. "I was unconscious for 3 days after the battle, and by the time I was coherent enough to ask questions, your husband's unit had been transferred east. I never got his full name, never found a way to thank him properly." Caleb stared at the letter with wonder. "Pa saved Mr. Truett's life? I mean, Pa Elias's life?" "Your father saved my life, and I've been looking for him for his family ever since." Truett's voice carried the weight of decades of searching. "I hired investigators, placed notices in newspapers across 3 territories. I knew his name was B. Weatherall from Company C, but that wasn't enough to track him down in a territory this size." "But how did you know it was Benjamin when you found us?" Lydia asked. "I didn't, not at first. But when you mentioned your husband died fighting Apache near Fort Sumner, and that he'd served in the Territorial Volunteers during the war." Truett shook his head in amazement. "Even then, I wasn't certain until I saw his Bible, saw his full name written inside." Ezra looked confused. "But if you were looking for Pa all along, how come you were riding alone in the desert when we found you?" "Because I'd just learned Benjamin was dead." Truett's voice grew heavy with old grief. "I'd finally tracked him to Roswell, only to discover I was 2 years too late. I was visiting his grave when grief and the heat overcame me." The revelation reframed everything. Their meeting hadn't been coincidence, but the culmination of a quarter-century search. Their rescue of Truett, not random charity, but the completion of a circle that Benjamin had begun on a battlefield decades earlier. "That's why you were so determined to help us," Lydia said, understanding flooding through her. "It wasn't just kindness, it was a debt you felt you owed." "It started as debt," Truett agreed. "But it became something else entirely when I got to know you, when I saw the kind of family Benjamin had built." He looked at Caleb and Ezra with unmistakable affection. "These boys carry their father's honor, his sense of right and wrong. And you, Lydia, you've raised them with the same values that made Benjamin willing to risk his life for a stranger." But there was more. From the portfolio, Truett withdrew a second Documenta Territorial Survey map, marked with careful notations in his own handwriting. "This is where it gets truly remarkable," he said, spreading the map on the table. "That worthless land Patrick Murphy told you about, the property you were traveling to claim when you found Meadow. You see where it's located?" Lydia studied the map, noting the familiar landmarks and the small section marked in red that represented their intended destination. Her breath caught as she realized what she was seeing. "It borders your land. More than borders it. The creek that supplies both properties rises from the same spring. The grazing lands are contiguous. In fact," he pointed to specific boundary markers, "if you owned that section, and it was properly managed, it would be some of the finest cattle country in the territory." But Murphy said it was alkali soil, worthless for anything. Patrick Murphy lied, just as I suspected. But here's what I discovered in town. Someone has been buying up small parcels all around this area, acquiring them cheap by spreading false information about their value. Truett's expression grew grim. The same someone who's now challenging my holdings with forged documents. Caleb traced the property lines with his finger. You think they wanted to buy up all the small sections, then use them to surround your ranch, control your access to water and markets? Exactly. It's an old tactic isolate, a large holding by controlling the approaches, then force a sale at below market prices. Truett rolled up the map carefully. But they didn't count on me finding Benjamin's family, or on that family having legitimate claim to a key piece of their puzzle. Do we still have claim to that land? Lydia asked. You do. The papers Murphy showed you were forged, but I had my lawyer investigate the actual status of that section. It's still available for homestead claim, and as my wife, you have every right to file for it. Ezra's eyes widened with understanding. So if Ma files claim to that land, it blocks whatever plan they had. It does more than that. It gives us a strategic advantage. Truett's smile was predatory. They've been operating on the assumption that they could gradually acquire everything around my holdings, but if we control that section legally and legitimately, their entire plan falls apart. The implications were staggering. What had seemed like a devastating assault on their security was actually an opportunity to strengthen their position immeasurably. But there's something else, Truett continued, his expression growing more serious. The man orchestrating this campaign, I know who he is now. Who? Senator Harrison Pike. He's been quietly assembling a land empire across southern New Mexico, using his political connections to smooth the legal path. Word is he's planning to run for territorial governor, and controlling this much land would give him enormous influence. The name meant nothing to Lydia, but she could see from Truett's expression that it carried weight. Pike's dangerous because he has legitimate political power backing his schemes. He can influence territorial judges, delay legal proceedings, even arrange for federal investigators to disappear if they get too close to his operations. Truett's voice grew hard. He's the kind of man who sees other people as obstacles to be removed, not fellow human beings with rights. What does he want with your ranch specifically? Water and rail access. My holdings control the most direct route for a proposed railroad spur that would connect Las Cruces to the mining operations in the Sierra Madre. Whoever controls that route controls millions in shipping fees. Truett paused. And Pike knows I'll never sell to him. We have history. What kind of history? The kind that involves a young woman who died because Pike valued profit over human life. Truett's expression darkened with old anger. My wife, the one who left Mesh, didn't just leave. She died trying to get back to me. Died because Pike's mining operation diverted water from the creek that ran past her family's farm. Contaminated what was left with tailings that poisoned anyone who drank from it. The revelation explained much about Truett's bitterness toward his business competitors, his determination to fight rather than compromise. I tried to get justice through the courts, he continued. Pike's lawyers buried me in paperwork for 3 years. Then the territorial judgeone of Pike's appointees ruled that the mining company bore no responsibility. By then, Maria was dead, along with her entire family. I'm so sorry, Elias. It was a long time ago, but it's why I know Pike won't stop with legal challenges. If he can't get what he wants through the courts, he'll try other methods. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses carried through the evening air. Multiple riders, moving fast and with purpose. Miguel, Truett called, but the foreman was already positioning men at strategic points around the house. Through the windows, they could see at least a dozen riders surrounding the ranch buildings. Armed men, their faces hidden by bandanas, clearly not here for social conversation. Mrs. Truett, a voice called from the darkness. Send out your husband, we just want to talk. Like hell, Truett muttered, checking his rifle. Caleb, get your mother and brother to the back room. There's a passage there that leads to the root cellar. "I'm not hiding while you fight my battles," Lydia said firmly. "You're 8 months pregnant and perfectly capable of handling a rifle." She moved to the gun rack, selecting a weapon with practiced ease. "Benjamin taught me to shoot, and frontier life has kept me in practice." Before Truett could argue further, shots rang out from multiple directions. The siege of the Truett ranch had begun, and with it, the final test of whether their chosen family could survive the forces arrayed against them. "Mrs. Truett," the voice called again, closer now. "Your husband has something that belongs to other people. Send him out, and nobody else gets hurt." "Go to hell!" Truett shouted back, firing a shot that sent the nearest rider scrambling for cover. The battle was joined, but this time, the family that had come together through Providence and choice would face their enemies together. The blood-stained letter that had started Benjamin's legacy of courage would see its completion in the courage of the family he'd left behind. Outside, more shots erupted, and Lydia felt the baby stir restlessly within her, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. But she also felt something else, the fierce determination that came from protecting not just her own life, but the future of everyone she loved. The circle that had begun on a Civil War battlefield was about to be completed in a very different kind of war, fought not for political ideals, but for the right of families to choose their own destiny. The siege stretched through the night, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out in the shadows between ranch buildings. Pike's men had positioned themselves strategically, cutting off escape routes while avoiding a direct assault that might bring territorial authorities running. "They're not trying to overrun us," Truett observed as he peered through a crack in the shuttered window. "They want us alive, at least for now." "Why?" Caleb asked from his position near the back door, Winchester ready in his hands. "Because dead men can't sign legal documents transferring property rights." Truett's voice was grim. "Pike needs me alive long enough to deed over the ranch, probably at gunpoint with witnesses who'll swear I was acting of my own free will." The loaded Winchester rifle rested across Lydia's lap as she sat in the reinforced corner Truett had insisted she occupy. Every few minutes, she felt the baby shift restlessly, responding to her elevated heart rate and the tension that filled the air like electricity before a storm. Miguel appeared at the kitchen door, moving with the careful silence of a man who'd fought Apache and survived to tell about it. "Patron," he whispered urgently. "Carlos counted at least 15 men out there, professional gunfighters, not cowboys or drifters. Someone paid good money for this kind of trouble." "Any sign of Pike himself?" "See, he's out by the main gate with that lawyer, Kensington, staying well back from the shooting but close enough to watch. The cowards approach-let hired guns do the dangerous work, while the man who ordered it remained safely out of harm's way." It was exactly what Truett had expected from Harrison Pike. What about the hands in the bunkhouse? Pinned down but holding their own. These men, they don't want to kill the workers bad for business if word gets out that Pike murders innocent cowhands. Miguel's grin was fierce. But they're not being too careful about it either. A new voice called from the darkness, cultured and confident in a way that made Lydia's skin crawl. "Truett, this is Senator Pike. I think it's time we talked like civilized men." "Civilized men don't surround houses with armed gunfighters," Truett shouted back. "Circumstances forced my hand. You've been unreasonable about perfectly legitimate business propositions. Your business propositions involved forged documents and fraudulent land claims." Pike's laughter carried easily across the yard. "Legal technicalities. Courts will sort all that out in due time. Meanwhile, I have a generous offer that could resolve our differences tonight." "I'm listening." "Transfer deed to your northern sections, the ones with disputed ownership, and I'll call off my men. You keep the ranch house and immediate surroundings, enough to live comfortably. Everyone goes home happy." It was exactly the kind of deal Pike would offer surrender most of his holdings to avoid losing everything, with the implied threat that refusal would result in total destruction. "And if I refuse?" Truett called. "Then we'll be forced to protect our legitimate property interests by whatever means necessary. I'd hate for your new family to suffer because of your stubbornness." The threat against Lydia and the boys was clear enough. Pike was offering one last chance for a negotiated surrender before escalating to direct violence. "I need time to consider," Truett shouted. "You have until dawn. After that, my patience runs out." As Pike's voice faded into the darkness, Truett turned to his makeshift war council, Lydia, Caleb, Ezra, and Miguel. "He's lying about the timeline," Truett said quietly. "Pike won't wait until dawn. He'll move before then, when he thinks we're tired and off guard." "So what do we do?" Caleb asked. "We give him something to think about." Truett's expression grew calculating. "Miguel, how many men do you have who know the territory well enough to move unseen in darkness?" "4, maybe 5 who are truly skilled at it. Send them out through the root cellar passage. I want them to circle around and create confusion in Pike's rear guard. Nothing heroic, just enough harassment to make him worry about his own safety." "And us?" "We prepare for company. Pike will try to take the house before his men start deserting." Truett checked his weapons methodically. "But first, we need to secure the most important things." He moved to his office safe, working the combination with practiced ease. From inside, he withdrew several documents, property deeds, water rights certificates, and legal papers that represented decades of careful planning. "Lydia, can you reach that loose floorboard behind the bookshelf?" When she nodded, he continued, "We're going to hide the real documents there. Pike can force me to sign papers, but if he doesn't have the originals to contest, his forgeries won't hold up in territorial court." As they worked to secure the papers, Ezra surprised them all with an observation that cut straight to the heart of their tactical situation. "Pa Elias, why don't we just leave? Sneak out the back and ride for Las Cruces. Get the territorial marshal. Because Pike owns half the territorial officials, and the other half are too far away to help in time." Truett's voice was patient but firm. "And because running now means abandoning everything we've built here. This land, this ranch, it's not just property, Ezra. It's home. It's your inheritance and your unborn siblings' future. Sometimes you have to fight for what matters. But what if we lose? Then we lose fighting for something worth fighting for." Truett put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Your father understood that. He could have stayed safe behind the lines during the war, but he chose to put himself in harm's way because he believed some things were worth the risk." Lydia watched her new husband explain the harsh realities of frontier justice to her son and felt a deep appreciation for the man Benjamin's sacrifice had brought into their lives. Elias Truett might have built his fortune through hard business practices, but his core values, loyalty, courage, protection of family, aligned perfectly with the principles Benjamin had died defending. "All right," she said, surprising them all with her decisiveness. "We fight. But we fight smart, and we fight together. Lydia, your condition." "My condition makes me more dangerous, not less." Her voice carried an edge they hadn't heard before. "A pregnant woman protecting her family is the most dangerous creature on earth. Pike's about to learn that." The next hour passed in careful preparation. Ammunition was distributed and counted. Positions were assigned that maximized their defensive advantages, and contingency plans were made for various scenarios. Miguel's men slipped away through the hidden passage, carrying orders to harass Pike's forces and create the impression of a larger defending force. As midnight approached, the baby began moving more actively, responding to Lydia's stress and the adrenaline coursing through her system. She found herself speaking to it softly, promising that it would be born into a world where its family owned their land free and clear, where no Senator Pike could threaten their security. "Ma," Caleb said quietly as they waited for Pike's next move, "are you scared?" "Terrified," she admitted, "but not of dying. I'm scared of leaving you boys without protection, of this baby growing up without knowing its family fought for its future." "We're going to win," Ezra said with the confidence of youth. "We have to. Good people always win in the end." "Good people win when they're willing to fight harder than bad people," Truett corrected gently. "And sometimes they win because they have more to lose." Outside, the sound of horses moving suggested Pike was repositioning his men for the final assault. The waiting was almost over. "Remember," Truett said as they took their positions, "Pike needs us alive, at least initially. That gives us an advantage. We can shoot to kill, but they'll try to wound and capture. Use that knowledge. And if they get inside, then we make them pay for every foot of ground." Truett's voice was stone, hard. "This house has sheltered our family. We don't give it up without making them bleed for it." In the distance, a coyote howled, or perhaps it was Miguel's signal that his harassment campaign was about to begin. Either way, the sound seemed to mark the end of the siege's opening phase and the beginning of something more decisive. Lydia checked her rifle one final time, thinking of Benjamin and the courage that had carried him through battles far larger than this one. She was his widow, carrying his grandchild, and she would show Pike's hired killers what happened when they threatened a family that had already survived war, poverty, and loss. The baby stirred again, and she whispered a promise that seemed to echo with the voices of all the strong women who had faced similar moments on the American frontier. "Hold on, little one. Your family's going to show these men what real strength looks like." Outside, Boots moved stealthily across the hard-packed earth, and the siege of the Truett ranch entered its final, most dangerous phase. The assault began at 2 in the morning, with a coordinated attack on 3 sides of the house. Pike's men moved with professional efficiency, using the cover of outbuildings and corrals to advance within striking distance before Truett's family even knew they were coming. The first indication of danger came when the kitchen window exploded inward, glass spraying across the floor as a dark figure rolled through the opening. Ezra, positioned near the pantry, reacted with the instincts of a boy raised on the frontier. His rifle barked once, and the intruder dropped without firing a shot. "They're inside!" Caleb shouted from the front room, where 2 more men had forced the door, despite the barricade Truett had constructed. The ranch house erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed through rooms that had known peace and family warmth just hours before. Lydia, from her protected corner, could see muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. Truett moved through the house like a man half his age, his rifle speaking with methodical precision. Years of hunting and territorial warfare had honed his skills to a razor's edge, and Pike's hired guns quickly learned they weren't facing a simple rancher. "Upstairs," Miguel's voice carried from the 2nd floor, where he'd positioned himself to cover the approaches. "3 men on the roof." The sound of boots moving overhead sent chills through Lydia. They were trying to come through the ceiling, to drop into the house, where the family's defensive positions couldn't protect them. Caleb proved his father's son in that moment, abandoning his assigned position to race upstairs with Miguel. The sound of their guns echoing through the upper floors was quickly followed by crashes and shouts as Pike's men discovered that the Truett family wouldn't be taken easily. But the assault was too coordinated, too professional. Even as they fought off the first wave, Lydia could see more figures moving in the darkness outside. Pike had committed serious resources to this attack, and they were being slowly overwhelmed by superior numbers. "Ezra," she called as her younger son reloaded his rifle with hands that trembled only slightly. "How many shots do you have left?" "Maybe 20, he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Make them count, baby." A new sound cut through the gunfire, the crackling of flames. Someone had set fire to the barn, and the orange glow was beginning to spread toward the house. Pike's men were trying to smoke them out, to force them into the open where superior numbers would tell. "The barn's burning," Truett shouted from across the room, where he was engaging 2 men who'd tried to force the back door. "They're trying to burn us out." But the fire was also working against Pike's men, illuminating their positions and making them easier targets. Lydia watched through her window as one of Miguel's harassing parties used the firelight to devastating effect, picking off 3 gunmen who'd thought themselves safely concealed. "Mrs. Truett," Pike's voice carried over the gunfire, magnified by a speaking trumpet. "This can still end peacefully. Send out your husband, and no one else needs to die." "Go to hell," Lydia shouted back before Truett could respond, her voice carrying all the fury of a mother protecting her children. Pike's laughter was cold and merciless, brave words from a woman in no position to make threats. "You have 5 minutes to reconsider, or I stop trying to take prisoners." The threat was clear surrender now. or face total war with no quarter given. It was the ultimatum of a man confident in his ability to impose his will through violence. But as the flames from the barn cast dancing shadows through the house, something unexpected happened. The baby, quiet through most of the siege, suddenly began moving with urgent intensity. Lydia gasped as sharp pain shot through her belly, different from anything she'd experienced before. "No," she whispered, recognizing the signs despite the impossible timing. "Not now." But her body had its own schedule, and the stress of combat had triggered the onset of labor. The child that Pike wanted to use as leverage against them was about to make its entrance into a world where bullets flew and fires burned. "Elias," she called, her voice tight with pain and determination. "The baby's coming." Truett's head snapped around, his face going pale despite the gunfire surrounding them. "Now! Now!" Another contraction gripped her, stronger than the first. "Rosa! I need Rosa." The housekeeper appeared from the kitchen, where she'd been tending a wounded ranch hand. Her face was streaked with soot and worry, but her hands were steady as she assessed Lydia's condition. "Si, Senora, it is time. But here, with the fighting?" "Here," Lydia confirmed grimly. "This baby's not waiting for Pike's permission to be born." Outside, the sound of approaching horses suggested Pike was bringing up reinforcements for a final assault. The burning barn cast an orange glow that turned the ranch yard into a hellscape of dancing shadows and deadly possibilities. "Miguel!" Truett shouted up the stairs. "Hold them for 20 minutes, whatever it takes." "Understood, Patron." But even as he spoke, the sound of splintering wood announced that Pike's men had found another way into the house. The battle was moving into its final, most desperate phase, and the Truett family was about to discover whether their chosen bonds were strong enough to survive the ultimate test. In the flickering light of the burning barn, Lydia gripped Rosa's hand and prepared to bring new life into a world where death stalked every shadow. The irony wasn't lost on her. Pike had come to destroy their family, but his attack was instead marking the moment when that family would become complete. "Hold on, little Sunrise," she whispered, using Truett's pet name for the baby. "Your family's fighting for your future." Outside, Senator Pike was learning that some prizes were worth any price to defend, and that a family forged by choice and tested by fire could prove stronger than any force arrayed against them. The baby's first cry pierced the night air just as Pike's final assault reached the front porch, and the sound seemed to transform everything. The thin wail of new life, defiant and pure, cut through gunfire and smoke with a power that no weapon could match. For a moment, even the attacking gunmen seemed to pause, perhaps remembering that they were fighting a family rather than faceless enemies. But Pike's voice, harsh with frustration, drove them forward again. "Take the house, now, before they can regroup." Lydia held her daughter, for it was a daughter, as Truett had somehow known it would be while Rosa worked to clean and wrap the tiny form. The baby was perfect, red-faced and furious at being born into such chaos, but healthy and strong. "She's beautiful," Truett breathed, appearing at Lydia's side, despite the battle raging around them. For just an instant, his weathered face showed nothing but wonder and joy. "Little Sunrise," Lydia whispered, then her voice grew stronger. "Elena Sunrise Truett." The name seemed to give the child substance, identity, something worth fighting for, beyond mere survival. Truett kissed his wife's forehead, then his new daughter's, before turning back to the windows, where muzzle flashes still lit the darkness. "Caleb, Ezra, you have a sister," he called, and the fierce pride in his voice seemed to energize the boys beyond their exhaustion. But Pike's men were through the front door now, and the fighting moved into the hallways where every corner could hide death. The sound of close-quarters combat knife work and pistol shots echoed through the house that had been their sanctuary. "They're in the hall," Miguel's voice carried from the stairs, where he was making his last stand against superior numbers. It was then that the baby's cry worked its strange magic again. From outside came new sound sources arriving at speed, men shouting orders, but not Pike's men. These voices carried the authority of law, the cadence of soldiers rather than hired killers. "Territorial Marshal, Everyone stand down. Stand down now. The gunfire slackened, then stopped entirely as Pike's hired guns found themselves caught between the defending family and a troop of territorial cavalry that had arrived with perfect timing. "Marshal Collins!" Truett shouted from the window. "In here!" Pike's men broke into the house. The next few minutes passed in a confusion of surrendering gunmen, barked orders, and the gradual restoration of peace to the besieged ranch. Through it all, baby Elena cried with the healthy outrage of a child whose first moments had been soundtracked by violence, but who had emerged into a world where justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. Senator Pike himself, caught between fleeing and trying to brazen out his situation, chose to maintain his dignity, even as his hired killers surrendered around him. "Marshal Collins," he said smoothly as the lawman entered the house. "I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding. We came here to serve legal papers and were fired upon without provocation." "That so?" Marshal Collins was a lean, weathered man whose eyes missed nothing as they surveyed the battle-scarred interior of the house. "Funny way to serve papers, with 15 armed men in the middle of the night. We had reason to believe Mr. Truett might resist legal process." "Save it for the judge," Collins cut him off. "I've got sworn statements from 3 of your men who were captured during the initial assault. Seems they're eager to testify about who hired them and what they were paid to do." Pike's confident expression cracked slightly. Professional gunfighters, facing territorial justice, often found cooperation more appealing than loyalty to employers who'd abandoned them. "You have no authority here." "I have territorial authority, which trumps whatever political connections you think protect you." Collins's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd enforced law in country where it was often the only thing standing between civilization and chaos. "Harrison Pike, you're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, and about 6 other charges I'll think of on the ride to Santa Fe." As Pike was led away in shackles, still protesting his innocence and threatening political retaliation, Truett found himself holding his new daughter while surveying the damage to his home and family. The house bore scars that would take months to repair, bullet holes in walls, shattered windows, bloodstains on floors that had known only happiness since Lydia's arrival. But the family was intact, grown by one small member whose first moments had been marked by violence but who would grow up knowing that her parents had been willing to fight for her future. "How did the marshal know to come?" Lydia asked as she rested, exhausted but triumphant. "Father Santos," Truett replied with a tired smile. "Seems he was more worried about our situation than he let on. Rode hard to Santa Fe to report Pike's activities to territorial authorities who weren't in his pocket. And they believed him? They've been building a case against Pike for months. Our situation just gave them the excuse they needed to move." Truett gently rocked his daughter, marveling at how light she felt after the weight of the night's violence. "Sometimes justice takes time, but it does come." Caleb and Ezra appeared in the doorway, both sporting minor wounds, but grinning with the satisfaction of men who'd proven themselves in battle. They'd defended their home, protected their family, and earned the right to call themselves Truetts in every sense that mattered. "Can we see her?" Ezra asked shyly, still holding the rifle that had served him so well. "Come meet your sister," Lydia said, pulling both boys close to see the tiny face that seemed to embody all their hopes for the future. Elena Sunrise Truett opened her eyes for the first time, fixing them on the faces of her family with the solemn intensity of someone who already understood that love was worth fighting for. Outside, dawn was breaking over the New Mexico territory, painting the mountains in shades of rose and gold that promised new beginnings. The Truett Ranch had survived its baptism by fire, and the family that defended it had discovered that blood ties mattered less than the bonds forged by choice and tested by adversity. Pike's conspiracy was ended, his forged documents worthless, his political career finished. But for the family gathered around a newborn baby in a battle-scarred ranch house, the real victory was simpler and more profound. They had faced the darkness together, and emerged into the light as something stronger than any of them could have been alone. 5 years later, Lydia stood on the rebuilt veranda of the ranch house, watching her children play in the yard where gunfire had once echoed through the night. Elena, now a bright-eyed 5-year-old, with her mother's determined spirit and her father's pale blue eyes, was teaching her doll to ride a stick horse, while Caleb and Ezra worked with the real animals in the corrals beyond. The Truett ranch had not merely survived, Pike's assault it had flourished. The legal victory that followed the senator's arrest had not only secured their original holdings, but had also resulted in the family acquiring several parcels that Pike's conspiracy had tried to steal from other small ranchers. The worthless land that had originally drawn them west now grazed some of the finest cattle in the territory. "Ma, watch this," Elena called, her stick horse galloping across the yard with the kind of fearless enthusiasm that reminded Lydia daily of how precious this normal life was, how easily it could have been lost. "I'm watching, Sunshine," Lydia replied, using the nickname that had evolved from Elias's original Little Sunrise. Caleb, now 22 and managing much of the ranch's daily operations, had grown into the kind of man his father Benjamin would have been proud to call son. The education Elias had provided, combined with practical experience managing thousands of acres and hundreds of cattle, had prepared him for the responsibilities of inheritance in ways that formal schooling never could have achieved. Ezra, 19 and possessed of his father's artistic eye, combined with his stepfather's business acumen, had discovered a talent for breeding horses that was bringing recognition to the Truett name throughout the Southwest. His sketches, once dismissed as childish fancy, now illustrated articles about ranch management in territorial newspapers. Mrs. Truett. Rosa appeared on the veranda, carrying the afternoon mail and wearing the satisfied expression of a woman whose household ran exactly as it should. "Letter from Santa Fe, official-looking." Lydia accepted the envelope with the mild curiosity of someone whose legal battles were long resolved. But as she read, her expression grew thoughtful, then pleased. "Good news?" Elias asked, emerging from his office where he'd been working on the ranch's yearly financial reports. At 71, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his mind remained sharp and his devotion to his family absolute. "Very good news. The territorial governor wants to appoint you to the new statehood commission. Something about needing voices from successful ranching operations to help write the new state constitution." Elias's eyebrows rose. "They want an old cattle baron to help govern. They want a man who built something lasting, who understands what it takes to make civilization work in difficult country." Lydia handed him the letter. "Besides, we've proven that good people can change the political process if they're willing to engage with it." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Pike's attempt to use political power for personal gain had ultimately resulted in honest men being asked to help shape the territory's future as a state. "What do you think?" Elias asked. "It would mean time away from the ranch, travel to Santa Fe for months at a time." "I think Benjamin would have said that duty to community matters as much as duty to family," Lydia replied. "And I think your experience fighting corruption might be exactly what the commission needs." Elena's laughter carried across the yard as she successfully jumped a fence with her stick horse, her small victory celebrated with the kind of uninhibited joy that reminded them daily of what they'd fought to protect. "Besides," Lydia continued, "this ranch will run itself with Caleb in charge, and Ezra's horse operation is bringing in enough money to support 2 families. It's time for you to think about legacy beyond land and cattle." That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in the rebuilt dining room, Elias shared the governor's offer and asked for their opinions. The conversation that followed demonstrated how completely the Weatherall children had become Truetts, not just in name, but in their understanding of responsibility and legacy. "You should do it, Pa," Caleb said without hesitation. "This ranch taught us that building something good requires more than just personal success. If you can help make the territory into a state that protects families like ours, that's worth doing." Ezra nodded agreement. And someone needs to make sure they write laws that prevent another Pike from trying what he tried. You understand how legal systems can be corrupted because you've seen it firsthand. Elena, not fully understanding the political implications but sensing the importance of the moment, climbed into Elias's lap with the wooden horse he'd carved for her before her birth. "Will you still live here, Papa?" she asked, using the name that never failed to bring a smile to his weathered face. "Of course, sunshine. This is home. This will always be home." He kissed the top of her head. "But sometimes grown-ups have to do important work away from home to make sure home stays safe. Like Mama did when she saved you in the desert." The child's innocent question captured something profound about the nature of their family's bond. They had all, at various times, ventured into uncertainty to protect what mattered most. "Exactly like that," Lydia said softly. Later, after the children were in bed, Lydia and Elias walked through the evening coolness to visit the small cemetery on the hill behind the house. Benjamin's grave was there now, his body moved from Roswell so that he could rest on the land his sacrifice had ultimately secured for his family. Beside his headstone was a newer marker for Maria Truett, Elias's first wife, whose body he'd had transferred from her family's abandoned farm so that she too could find peace in a place where love had triumphed over loss. "Think they'd approve?" Elias asked, gesturing toward the graves. "I think they'd be proud," Lydia replied. "Benjamin always said the highest calling was service to something larger than yourself. And Maria, from what you've told me about her, she believed in justice and protecting the innocent." They stood in comfortable silence, two people who had found each other through tragedy and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate losses. The ranch spread below them, prosperous and peaceful, with lights beginning to twinkle in the bunkhouses and outbuildings where good people did honest work. "There's something else in that letter I didn't mention at dinner," Elias said eventually. "Oh?" "They want to name the new county after someone who represents the territory's values. They're suggesting Weatherall County, after Benjamin's service during the territorial wars and our family's stand against corruption." Lydia felt tears spring to her eyes. The idea that Benjamin's name would live on in the geography of the land he'd helped defend was more than she'd ever dared hope for. "He'd have been embarrassed by the honor," she said, "but secretly pleased. The letter also mentions they want to establish a school in the county seat. They're asking if we'd consider endowing it with a fund for children whose families can't afford tuition. Something about ensuring that frontier children get the same educational opportunities as those in established cities." It was exactly the kind of practical philanthropy that would have appealed to Benjamin, not grand gestures, but concrete help for people trying to build better lives for their children. "We should do it," Lydia said without hesitation. "All of it. The commission, the school, the county naming. It's time to give back what we've been blessed to receive." As they walked back toward the house, Elena's voice drifted from her bedroom window, where she was supposed to be sleeping, but was instead singing softly to her collection of carved animalsa menagerie that now included not just the original horse but a dozen other creatures that Elias had whittled during quiet evenings. "She's going to be something special, that one," Elias observed. "They all are. That's what happens when children are raised knowing they're loved unconditionally and that their family will fight for their future." Inside the house, they paused in the rebuilt parlor, where Benjamin's Bible still held a place of honor on the mantelpiece, next to the family portrait they'd commissioned the previous year. The photograph showed all of them, Elias and Lydia, Caleb and Ezra, grown tall and confident. Elena perched on her father's knee with a mischievous smile that suggested she'd been wiggling throughout the long exposure. But it was the inscription beneath the portrait that captured the essence of what they'd built together. The Truett family chosen by love, bound by choice, tested by fire. "No regrets?" Elias asked, as he did sometimes when the weight of their unusual beginning seemed to settle over them. "None," Lydia replied firmly. "We didn't choose how we found each other, but we chose what to build together. That's what matters." Outside, A gentle night wind stirred the cottonwoods that had grown tall around the house, their leaves whispering secrets to the stars that stretched endlessly across the New Mexico sky. The desert that had brought them together through desperation and chance now cradled their prosperity and peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the political work of statehood, the ongoing demands of ranch management, the daily joys and struggles of raising children in country that remained beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. But tonight, the Truett family rested secure in the knowledge that love, tested by adversity and strengthened by choice, could indeed conquer whatever darkness threatened their light. In her bedroom, Elena finally fell asleep, the wooden horse clutched in her small hand, a tangible link to the moment when her father had begun carving a future for a child he'd never seen but already loved. And in that carving, in that love, in that choice to build family from the raw materials of chance and necessity, lay all the hope and promise that had always drawn people west toward unknown horizons and uncertain tomorrows. The Truett ranch slept beneath a canopy of stars, sheltering a family that had learned the most important truth of the frontier. Home isn't a place you find, but a commitment you make, defended with courage and sustained by love that chooses to endure.